Hello, today we're going to go through doing an example of how to focus on our output and then kind of work backwards to the problem, adding in our different variables. We'll eventually get a working program, kind of step by step, working from our output down to our input so that we get a consistent result with our program. So I have here a clean folder. We're going to go ahead and call this a simple program. What we're going to do is create a conversion program. So we're going to call this conversion.java. We're going to start off with our Java doc. This is a What we're also going to do is go ahead and have our logic here for our main at this point in time. But we're also going to introduce something else in here. When you're working with classes, typically you have a constructor. Now we're not doing a lot with that constructor right now, but normally you will have a little bit further stuff that you want to do with the constructor, like set up the class, have other things initialized, those types of things. But for now, we're just going to say default constructor. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a private conversion. We're just going to create that method. We're not going to have anything in it. Just default for that. Now we're going to go ahead and write our default main. And it's going to have what is known as a parameter. And that's going to be our string args we'll get to. So public static void main string gr arg. Okay. And we're just going to do a system.out.println right now. And we're going to say Celsius to Fahrenheit. And we're just going to capitalize this. But before we go further, we want to actually make sure that what we works, that we don't have any typos, which is common. And so we're going to go ahead and type in javac conversion.java. Looks like everything worked out okay, so we're going to go ahead and run the actual class. And we can see that we have our output. So this is what we're starting with. Next, we want to take one thing at a time. So we're going to go ahead and create our variables. Top of our class here, we're going to go ahead and create, actually inside our main here, we're going to create our variables. Not ideal, but later on we'll move them into the class. We're going to start with convert. Actually, you go ahead and use a float. So we'll call this float. And we're going to set that just to 1.0 float like that. Now, what we're going to do, this is why you want to take it step by step and start with your output and go backwards, is go ahead and substitute out that variable that we had there, that number that we had there, with the actual value that we want. Let's see what our code looks like with this. See if we have any typos or anything else. Everything looks good. Let's see how it actually looks. And you can see now that we have our variable sitting in there. So next we need to do the next portion of our variables that we want to replace. And we're going to set this just for a minute, 2.0, just to see it. And then we're going to go to where our variable is, and we're going to convert it where we want our variable to be, and substitute it in. Again, we're going to compile and run. And everything so far seems to work as we want it. Some important things to note. You want to make sure that you always declare the variable. And remember, we're doing one at a time here so that we can test things, simple things. So we want to make one change at a time, starting with our output line that we had, then making a change to one variable, then making a change to the next variable, till we have it kind of looking like we want it. Now the next thing we need to do is actually have a way to convert from this to Fahrenheit. So now this is where the math comes in. So you could leave these initialized if you wanted to and then turn around and do a math line. So let's go ahead and do that. So think about it this way. We have our variables. We have our output. Later on, we'll have user input, which will happen here. But right now, we're going to have our calculations in here. Or also known as processing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our Fahrenheit. And what is Fahrenheit? Well, convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. You take your Celsius, you multiply it by 1.8, and then you add 32. So just to make sure order of operations happens correctly, we're going to go ahead and do this. We multiply by that, and then add that out. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what our output looks like now that we've added our processing section in. Looks like everything compiled correctly, and we can see now that we have 33.8. So if you do 0, for instance, we compile 32, that looks correct. And just so for kind of fun value, we'll do a negative 40. Notice this value is being overwritten. That's fine. So if you want to zero it out so you can see that output so that it works. And we see that that conversion worked as well. We're just basically testing some functionality, make sure that our results and our formula is correct. Now notice, because we have these declared here and our variables here and everything's lined up, we did our output statement, we changed out the variables that we want, and since we have default values here, if for some reason you need to change your processing or maybe change your algorithm a little bit, or try a different approach, or things are not working like you want in your processing, you can comment that out. Compile it again, and you can see your output with just the default values to see, hey, is it a problem with my calculation, or where does the problem exist? You could comment out certain lines testing the different processing you were doing. So for an example of this, to kind of break it out, what you could do, for instance, is you could calculate this and store it somewhere. And then you could take the variable again and take that value and do that, breaking down the problem into separate steps, for instance. The advantage of this is you can test each individual piece of the code separately, so to make sure things are working correctly. And because we have our output like this, we can test each piece independently. So maybe we want to just check to make sure the 32 is working correctly. Well, you can compile, run it, and see that, oh yeah, that is adding correctly. It's taking the default value and adding it in, so that part is working. Or maybe you're having trouble with a different part of the function. You can comment that section out and want to make sure your multiplication is working correctly. You could compile it and then run and see, okay, so that seems to be working just fine. Hopefully this will help you see a little bit clearer on how to code your code here. Some things to note of change is we're going to put default constructors, we're going to make them private. We're also adding a final tag up in here. This is just some kind of code cleanup that we're doing. We have a nice thing here with our Java doc as well, so our Java doc documentation runs out as expected. And then the rest of our stuff here as well. Note, the important thing that I want you to take note of is that you're going to want to focus on your output first. You're then going to turn around and substitute in the variables and output that you want, putting the fields in the replacing the variables that you want one at a time till you get the output that you expect, and then go back in and start doing the processing. And the last little piece of this puzzle will be later on, we'll add in an additional input class to make it easier to do user input and everything else. But for now, for simple testing and the simple programs we're working on, one step at a time, you don't want to make it too complicated.